Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Frank Talk. I'm frankrausanpereira, and I have a gentleman on the program who needs no introduction. I'm a fan of his work. He's done some tremendous work as far as mapping true Indian history is concerned. Work on Mahabharata and everything else is phenomenal. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Raj Vedam on the program today. He is the co-founder of the think tank Indian History Awareness and Research, and he resides, of course, in the United States, but his work on ancient Indian history is phenomenal, like I already said. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Raj Vedam on the program.
Thank you, Frank.
Namaste and welcome.
Namaste. It's a real pleasure and privilege. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Vedam, so much that I want to speak to you about, don't know where to start, but let's start with Indian history, and I've seen a couple of your talks about how and why there is a need to have a relook at Indian history. So I want to hear it live from you right now about, what your thoughts are on this subject, and why do you feel so strongly that we need to have a relook at the way Indian history is written, the way Indian history is taught, especially in our schools?
Very, very interesting question. Thank you, Frank. So it turns out that today you take a look at all around us. You see a certain intellectual strain and a kind of thinking out there, which makes us pause and wonder, where did this come from? In the India which I grew up, it still wasn't like this. And in the India of the 1947s and 50s, perhaps, it was perhaps more innocent times, fresh from the freedom struggle, and there was a certain idealism out there. Today you find enormous hatred on the Bharatiya civilization. You find enormous hatred from every media, whether it is the mass media, given the movies, the print media, the television talking heads. Everybody seems to have so much of hatred, which goes beyond politicization, beyond the politics that is currently in the country. It goes beyond that. So it begs the question, why is this happening? And on the average, when I talk to youth or somebody, I see they are so deracinated. They have no concept or any idea about the Bharatiya civilization, where they come from. In fact, they're Pavlovian responses. The minute you say something about the Bharatiya civilization, there's a response that borders on the repulsive, that this is all archaic, this is all primitive, this is all backward, superstitious. And this is the kind of attitude we see. And one is shocked because the amount of disinformation that is stuffed into people's head is so much that it begs the question, where did this all start? So that triggered me into this search for the Bharatiya civilization itself. When I saw distortions, for example, in the way Indian learning is presented in the Western media as well as academia, I started off on this journey. Eventually, I found that there are up to 5 frameworks that are distorting the way Indian history has been written. We have something called darshanas in our system, right? The Indian philosophical system, we got darshanas, a way of looking at the world and seeking the truth. Now there is something that's the opposite of darshana, the way of distorting the truth that has come about. And we are finding that these frameworks started in colonial India. Prior to the colonial people, Indians had a pretty good understanding of their own history, about who they were, Sthala Puranas, and oral histories, and Vamshavalis, and all those kind of things. They had all genealogies and things like that. They had a good understanding of who they were. The colonial people wanted to talk about who these people are in terms of their understanding. So they came about with a certain narrative on the history of India, which suited their purpose. And their purpose, obviously, was to control India, to try and show that you're backward, you're primitive, and Europe has got so much to offer you, a superior civilization. So that was the kind of narration that came about initially. They are also Anglican church people who came about with the idea that God created the world in 4000 BC, destroyed Noah's flood, 3000 BC, nothing could survive that flood event. And when they encounter the Puranas with great genealogies, their reaction to that is, this is all fictitious, this is all problematic, let's correct this. So they went about this process of distortions. So we see timeline, chronology distortion, as well as positioning Indian works as spurious, that they cannot accept it because it did not fit into their worldview, which was, we are now talking 1700s, 1800s. That was their level of thinking. Then we find that people like William Jones have found commonality of Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. And they wanted to ask a question, why are these languages related? Therein was born the Eurocentric view form. The Eurocentric view sees that languages are related because there was perhaps an ancestral language from which all these daughter languages, European languages as well as Sanskrit, has evolved. And so there was a toxic mix of ideas, with German Aryanism thrown in over there, with nationhood, struggles for nationhood over there, all these kind of things that goes about and creates the notion that there is something called Proto-Indo-European ancestral language, whose homeland, after a lot of muckraking, was finally put somewhere in the Central Asian region, Caspian Sea, Black Sea, that area. And they said that these people had gone and colonized the world with the invention of iron, swords, and things like that, and domesticating the wild horse, and they were able to do all of these things. That is the theory. So they came about Eurocentric notions on what the Indian civilization is. Again, tempered a lot with racism, tempered with the notions of the European supremacy and things like that. Then we find that wherever colonials went, the missionaries also went along with them. An unfortunate consequence of our world history. Wherever you go, whether in Americas or elsewhere, Africa, India, we see this kind of thing happening. The missionaries came obviously with the idea to change the demographics in India, the Great Commission that they had, and they had to go about bearing witness to everybody. So they came about at the forefront of translating works. We find that when the Puranas are translated or the Vedas are translated, many of these people were missionaries who are doing these kind of things, and they had a certain worldview which is also injected into the English translations of these works. For example, Wilson's translation of the Puranas and all this kind of thing. There's a certain worldview that has been injected over there. There's a way of looking at it. So that distortion happened over there. Then we are seeing since 1947, you might think sense has prevailed in India, but unfortunately, we inherited Fabian socialism via Nehru, who came about with a certain idea that we made a tryst with destiny, except his idea of a tryst with destiny was to jettison the past. That the past is primitive, backward, superstitious, and other such things. We need to make a clean breakaway from that, and we have to have a new India. So, with this kind of thinking, he injected certain ideas into the discourse based on socialism. And from there, you might think, all right, benign, but things are happening. I won't call it exactly benign, but things are happening. But since 1972, with Indira Gandhi making a pact with the Marxists, we have had the Marxists controlling the HRD sector in India, and they control the entire ecosystem of learning in India today. They've edged out the emic perspective, the internal practitioners' understanding of history, Bharatiya civilization, completely edged out in every university in India, in every department of history, gone. The only people who are there are Marxists, socialists. They control the rules, they control the funding, they control every single conference, whatever happens, the grant and such things. So you find a certain kind of narrative. And I have seen an iteration after iteration of things like NCRT textbooks, how the Indic content is gradually removed out and more toxic content has been put over here. Now, you might logically ask, okay, Raj, why on earth are these guys doing these things? We had the motive of the colonials that they want to rule India, Eurocentric people, the racism idea and Western superiority. The missionaries just convert all of India. That's their motive. What about the socialists? Why not they do that? Well, the socialists and the Marxists are cut from the same cloth. So both of them think like Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that all of history is a history of conflict. He could not conceive of a history that is not a history of conflict, of class struggles, this one against that one against this one. To him, that was it. All of human history is a history of class conflicts. There's no other way of looking at it. And he believed that change can come on the back of a bloody revolution. And after the bloody revolution, you have this classless utopia where everybody is happy, world is a beautiful place, and all these kinds of things. So we have seen the evolution of USSR and China these days and such things. But the socialists believe in the same nonsense, except that they believe change can come through democratic processes rather than bloody revolution. Change can come via democracy. And that's why you see the Nehruvian socialism ideas. But they believe in the same thing, that the past is primitive, backward, cause of conflict, So their entire anti-darshana has been towards looking with great bigotry at all of the Bharatiya civilization and distort that message. And their progeny are there today in all the studios that you see, in whether it's in television studios or movie studios, generating this nonsense that you see, completely distorting the message of the Bharatiya civilization, and have brought the entire nation so deracinated today that we cannot have a conversation with most people on the Bharatiya civilization. We have come to that point. Frank, I'll stop over there, a long
Absolutely. No,
monologue,
no.
but
Points were duly noted, and this is an aspect that I want to take forward with you. Since we're speaking about distortion, what corrective measures do we need to take? How do we rectify this? That is the big question, because even if you want to, there's very little that can be done at this point in time.
that deserves a deep sigh because there are just so many people who are working who are working on this concept, trying to figure out how exactly we can reclaim the situation, the narrative, if you will. Unfortunately, Frank, like I said, the ecosystem in academia from where scholarship should emanate is manned entirely by socialists and Marxists today. So they will not allow a sixth place at the table. And the sixth place is the emic practitioner, the Sanskrit scholar, the Bharatiya scholar, who says, all right, we have taken the colonial perspective, we have taken the Eurocentric perspective, we've taken the missionary perspective, we have taken the socialist perspective, we've taken the Marxist perspective, and all of these have got a hand in the ideologies they want to impress on the Bharatiya civilization. So they seem to resonate with each other. Wait a minute, there's a place at the table for the sixth guy here. And the sixth guy is a chap who's experienced this history for the last 10,000 years. And why is he not over here? Why is his voice not being heard? This is a logical question people must ask but are not asking. The minute this voice comes up, this nexus of forces over here comes talking about saffron, fascist, ideology, Hindutva, and all of these kind of things, screaming down the emic voice rather than academically engaging. An academician is expected to engage. You're expected to engage, look at alternative viewpoints. If I'm an expert in the field of engineering, I keep abreast of all the papers in my area, whether it is complementary to my way of thinking or a different idea coming over there. I examine them, look at the weaknesses, discuss, write papers. This is what I do. And I'd expect the same thing logically and rationally to happen even in the social studies areas. Unfortunately, we're looking for rationalism in a place where dogma and ideology reigns supreme and nothing to do with rationality or the truth over here. So to answer your question, there is need for a sixth place at the table. The NEP that has come about recently is not enough. It is old. It is it is using the same old nonsense. It has been repackaged and sold to people. I don't believe that's the right way to go about because it doesn't have teeth. The NEP does not have teeth to have a certain kind of idea. They want Indic content, but they're not clarified what Indic content. The Indic content will still be the same nonsense of class struggles, of the subaltern voices, and these are all pushed up as if these can be conflated to the entire civilization for all times without taking note of, is there a top-down approach? Is there a bottom-up approach? One has got to see the top down is aspirational. This is the Bharatiya view of the idealism and other things seen for a civilization. That view has been now distorted and thrown out. The bottom up view, which is the subaltern voices, everybody's class struggle, that has been conflated to the entire civilization for all times. Is that correct? Is that correct? So one will have to take cognizance of these things. So to create a scholarship, one would require some kind of teeth in NEP. The government should come out there and make appropriate measures so that there are Bharatiya scholars over here who are generating content. Today, if you want content to be developed, you need to publish in a publication. Which journal today will publish if somebody were to write a paper talking about the antiquity of the Indian civilization? It'll be rejected summarily by the editors of the journal who say that, wait a minute, our reviewers who are there at JNU and at Harvard, they've rejected this because we all know the 1500 BC Aryans invaded India, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, its antiquity is not there. So, period. You put constraints based on your dogma and ideology, and you refuse to remove those shackles, and you cannot go beyond that. How can science progress? How can truth be accomplished by this kind of a thing. So we need an alternate scholarship here, which is separate of all of this socialist nonsense. There's got to be a meeting point somewhere, but the chasm is so great now that there's no meeting ground. There is simply no meeting ground. We need to evolve this scholarship over here. And when it comes to a point where you're graduating students and PhDs who are writing papers and have their own journals, then you can have a dialogue happening over there. But till then, this side is protecting their turf, screaming saffron, fascist, Hindutva, and these kind of things. Change must come within academia. Until then, it unfortunately, Frank, is that private citizens like myself are out there creating scholarship in our off work time and trying to create the awareness of that. So the burden of the Bharatiya civilization shouldn't be on private citizens. What is the government doing? Is there an identification of the Bharatiya civilization, or is there this erasing thing that has come about with Nehru, tryst with destiny, that is 1947? That's a question we must ask ourselves. Who are we? Are we inheriting this massive gift of our ancestors, or are we erasing them completely in this cancel culture of today? So this is a question that we need to ask.
Absolutely. I mean, rightly pointed out that this is the question that we need to ask, shout on top of our voices. I don't know what we need to do. We need to be heard about what this is, because like you rightly pointed out, this is an amazing gift that has been passed down by our ancestors to us. We've always been a knowledge hub, a knowledge center, the kind of information that we've always had passed down from our Saptarishis and down from there to everybody else has been amazing. It's a treasure trove. It's nothing else. It's a treasure trove. And that's why we were attacked. And that's why it was all taken away from us over here. If you see the invaders, the first thing that they took away from us was our scriptures, was the information and the knowledge that we have. On this note, I'd like to ask my follow-up question as well, Dr. Raj Vedam. These 5 forces that you're talking about,
Frameworks.
are
Yes.
they at some level also worried and concerned and scared about all this information and this knowledge that we have, and they are worried at some level if it actually comes out into the open, then there is no stopping us, because we are a nation that has produced 14-year-old statesmen who have conquered everyone and everything in their path. We are a nation that have achieved anything there is to achieve. Look at the Cholas and everything that they have done in the maritime domain. Look at anyone else for that matter, the Vijayanagara Empire, more recently, just about 500 years ago. So is this something that these 5 frameworks are worried and concerned about at some level?
Absolutely, absolutely. There is every evidence of collusion between these nexuses, and there's every evidence that there is an echo chamber out there. When one of their flock starts with a notion on social media or elsewhere, you see a joyous cacophony of all other voices going about in ecstasy, trying to push up these outrage, if you will, out there to try to amplify these voices. We are seeing that repeatedly. Common sense question for whoever is watching this. When is the last time you saw New York Times or you saw any of these people invite somebody from the other side to come and give their point of view? What you're seeing is a wall of bigotry that is being thrown to you as news. This is what you're seeing time and again. When New York Times carries out its many against India kind of editorials written by luminaries who are eminent historians in India, you must ask the question, did they even ask, call up somebody on the phone and ask, what is your opinion? This person says this. This is journalism 101. You'd think that somebody's got to do this. But when did you see this? When is the last time you saw that? Never. This itself tells you it's a collusion. It's not a search for truth. It's not a journalist's incompetence. This is an editorial policy that has been pushed down from the very top to make things happen this way. So yes, there is very definitely people are afraid that if these voices come out there, there would be awakening, massive awakening, and the political forces behind this are worried that these are traditionally people who will vote along with the Bharatiya civilizational values. So whichever political party is over there saying they stand for these values, they probably will vote for them. And that's a big fear. And one way to keep them where they are is to demonize, discredit, and this kind of thing. And we are seeing that happening from a variety of platforms. from a variety of. Recently, there was something, an abomination called Dismantling Hindutva Conference. This was done in the United States a couple of months back or so. And there were all these eminent luminaries of Marxist and socialist history or the leftist history over there. And the strange thing is, they would not define the very terms used in that conference. An academic is expected to be rigorous in the jargon that you use. If I use a term, I need to define it, define the contours of the term, the meanings of the term. And so I can examine it correctly, semantically, logically, rationally, and see where it is going to. We didn't see that. We only saw something pushed down that this is Hindutva, and they kept saying, no, no, Hinduism is separate from Hindutva, and all this nonsense. But at the end of the day, the messages given by the organizers themselves showed that there was no such dichotomy at all. They were talking about the same thing as if there is a dichotomy over there. That wasn't true at all. It was a fig leaf for their bigotry over here. So you're seeing nonsense like this where the other voice is not over there. AHA, American Historical Association, they had their annual conference going on right now, actually. It's going on right now. And they have panels by luminaries from Rutgers universities and elsewhere, where the message is about how history is being now talked about by the Hindutva government in India and all these kind of things. But there's not one panel or discussion or scholar being invited to have a counter viewpoint. So you're seeing a collusion of academic bodies, entities, media, and elsewhere who are sold in certain narratives. Because, like I said, five frameworks are pretty big global forces. There are a lot of global interests over here. And these have got deep pockets in funding and networks everywhere. And to fight them, to reclaim the narrative is so difficult because they're holding it tightly to their chest. To pry open their hands and change narrative is difficult. So we will see a lot of antagonism when voices like this come out there because of fear that things will change. Because at the end of the day, it is not academia holding the fort in a monologue, but it is the public who are receiving this knowledge and using it in a certain way. And we are seeing that there is greater and greater civilization hunger in Indians who want to know who they really are, what is their past. And Bharatiya civilization people are seeing reduced space for practice of who they are. They're seeing the space is reduced further and further. So that anger is going to come out in some manner. And my hope is it's an intellectual anger that will come out and that will show what the Bharatiya civilization is all about by deconstructing these. You're welcome to have a different point of view. It's not as if that this is a binary, you're wrong, I'm right. You have a viewpoint to say from the bottom up, there is value over there. You present that along with the top down. Now that is academia. Now that is accurate. Now that is a quest for truth. You only push one point of view, that's propaganda, that's ideology. And they're scared because they're wanted that position is now going to disappear with these new voices. So they'll do everything they can to prevent these voices from coming up. That's what we're seeing today.
You know, Dr. Vedam, you said that you hope that these voices and this anger comes out in the form of some intellectual property or something in that domain. But my fear is that that voice will never be allowed to be heard, and that's going to be a big challenge, as far as bringing out the actual truth is concerned.
Very true, very true. And that is why my hope is that the government realizes the value of this. The government should realize the value of, see, at the end of the day, Frank, we need to sit down and ask, who are we? Sit down over a cup of tea and ask, who are we as a people? Are we people who only have the following identity? We sing Janagana Mana, we salute the tricolor, and we watch cricket and Bollywood. Is that all we are? This pop culture, is this all there is to us? The minute I talk with Rishi Kannada, have I become a bigot? Is Rishi Kannada, who said Vaisheshika and got about this whole new darshana of perception and inference, which has been the driving force for many civilizations, as I show in my talks, is talking about him something wrong? Do we as a civilization connect and say, it is that kind of thinking that's part of my Bharatiya civilization? This is who we are as a people. This is the history of our nation as a people. Or Is our history that, yeah, we welcomed everybody from everywhere? There was some fine gentlemen who came from Ghazni, and they looked at the splendor of Indian temples, and they built splendid capitals in Ghazni, and we had this lovely life over here. Is this the way we want to present this nonsense? So the question is, if we are on a quest for truth, why don't we say the truth? This is the truth. Objective history that is based on facts, evidence, and so on. So this is what we need to get out there and present.
Absolutely, absolutely. Talking about Bharatiya knowledge and our knowledge heritage,
Mhm.
uh, how has it been used or misused, by the West?
I just finished a 10-day workshop at the MIT Vedic Institute in Pune. So they invited me to give a 10-day workshop on Indian knowledge systems, actually the world knowledge systems. So I took on the task of trying to see, when we talk about knowledge creation in the world, how far back do we go, start, and see where we are today. Today we are with quantum computing, we are with DNA, with CRISPR, genetic scissors, and things like that. We are at great technologies. How did we get here? So I took on the role of looking at deep history. I don't call it prehistory, that's a bigoted word. Deep history. I go to deep history and talk about epistemology in various civilizations. The epistemology in ancient Bharat, the epistemology in Mesopotamia. When you say Mesopotamia, it means the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians. We're talking about all of them, and the Assyrians. And when you talk about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, ancient Egypt. So I looked at the epistemology for all of these people and tried to show at various points in time what is the evolution. Whenever these civilizations privileged perception and inference, they made advancements. Whenever they went to dogma by theological constructs, it immediately stopped. Knowledge generation stopped, and there were issues in that civilization. So we saw that repeatedly. For example, looking at the history of the world, looking at the Roman Empire and other such things, we saw at what point, from a point of knowledge, they went into a full stop. At some point, going into dark ages. We saw that in the Greeks, in the Romans, we saw that in Egypt, we saw that in Babylon, we saw it in various other parts. China and India luckily escaped that kind of theological construct, but we were subject to other things, invasions that put a full stop on knowledge, literally, in India. So bottom line, through this workshop, I tried to show the knowledge systems coming from a darshana, epistemology, to seeking the truth. They sought the truth in things like medicine, in astronomy, in mathematics and other things, to model the natural phenomena around them. Looking at the skies, they looked at the objects going over there, try to make sense out of that, try to evolve models based on that, try to get mathematics based on that. Then obviously with people's health, you look at medicine, and they evolved mechanisms to do that. So we talked deeply about many of these kind of topics. Then in the process of doing that, I also showed that the Bharatiya civilization has got great antiquity. As we can see from the astronomy and other things, there's great antiquity in the Bharatiya civilization. And so, some of the deep scholars that we have, for example, talking about Shishruta, talking about the darshanas itself, when we say Samkhya, when did Samkhya come about? If you listen to Max Muller, he'll tell you around 1200 BCE. Unfortunately, Max Muller is using the linguistic framework. We can see evidence of Samkhya going to Rig Veda, and we can infer great antiquity in some of the Samhitas and other things coming out of the Rig Veda itself, based on the astronomy, going back to pretty ancient periods of time. Today, we are all conditioned to think the minute I say anything 3000 BC, man, they're all primitive people. Harappa, yeah, they were civilized. The rest of the people are Stone Age. If you go to 5000 BC, say they're all Stone Age people, right? What were they doing? So we have an inability to push beyond some of these constraints put on our mind by our education system to think about deep history. But people were as abstract thinking as you and me, even in those early times, using whatever language they used to communicate. Bottom line, they generated knowledge. Samkhya came at an early period of time. Mimamsa came after that. After that, we have Vaisheshika that came about. Then much later is when Buddhism came about. So we know about the timelines over here. So we know that ancient Indians started generating knowledge in an ancient period of time. We know that the Egyptian civilization, the Ebers Papyrus, the Moscow papyrus, the Smith papyrus, which contain mathematics, medicine, and things like that. So these were after 1800 BCE, 1500 BCE, and so on in Egypt. And if you go to Mesopotamia, you see the kind of medicine they had, the kind of astronomy they had. You look at the calendrical system, you say, wait a minute, there seems to be a common thread running throughout the world. What is that common thread? They had a luni-solar calendar. They had intercalary months. The question comes, is there a common point for this knowledge? And if there's a common point, where is that common point? So these are some of the questions we addressed in the workshop, and I showed the antiquity of Indian civilization, and I showed various routes by which knowledge would have dispersed, starting from very ancient migrations out of India. I'm now talking about from genetic evidence, I'm talking about very great migrations out of India. Then the Harappan trade times, when there was trade with Mesopotamia, with Babylon, with the Elamites and the Kassites, Babylonians, and so on. Then I'm talking about the contact that the Minoans and the others used to have, the Mycenaeans used seem to have with India around 2500 to 1500 BC and so on. Then I'm talking about various other time frames. I'm talking about the philosopher time frame, Pythagoras, Democritus, who apparently came to India, took knowledge systems over there. I'm talking later on about the pre-medieval period, people like Dioscorides, the Syrian and the Armenian people who had contact in India pre-Islamic times. Then from Islamic times itself, with works like many of the Indian works translated into Arabic in the Baghdad House of Wisdom. Then I'm talking about the Europeans itself. Even before Vasco da Gama, there were Europeans coming to India and taking knowledge systems out. Then throughout the colonial times, knowledge has been taken out. So there is a lot of evidence I've collected over various periods of times in geographies and fields, technical fields, that show that there's got to be some kind of a common point to this knowledge system, enriched by cultures like the Arabs and others, transmitted into Europe, coming back towards the so-called European scientific revolution and the industrial revolution and so on and so forth. We are seeing that there has been a DNA of thought that is common through all of these cultures. And that is what I highlighted in my workshop. So in terms of the knowledge systems we're using today, Frank, any topic you take, we can try to see its DNA and see how far back things have gone. There is a wrong notion today in the world that everything began and ended with Renaissance. Everything began with Renaissance, ended with Renaissance. Everything in the Western civilization starts with ancient Greece, a period of dark ages, 1,000 years or so, rediscovery of Greece. During that time, India and the Arabs were custodians of Greek knowledge. This is the positioning in the Western media, by the way, academia. And you see that flowering of Western thought in the 1500s, 1600s, leading to the present time. So there is an attempt to erase the contributions of every other civilizations, and I've shown the dishonesty of that portrayal with evidence, because we are not here giving opinions alone. We have evidence. Everything I have has got facts and evidence to back up why I'm saying this, what is the data I'm using, what is the methods I'm using. There is data to back up all of these things. So what we are seeing is today's knowledge systems owes a great debt to the methods of the past. If it is not for the past, you could not be in the present with the kind of systems that we have. If it was not for certain historical incidents, we'd be perhaps in a much bigger and better place than where we are today. The evolution of world knowledge systems since 1600s, 1500s, 1600s has followed a trajectory based on the philosophical systems of Europeans. Europeans had a philosophy which they traced back to the Greeks. The Greek epistemology, if you look at Plato and works, is basically Vaisheshika. It is Vaisheshika in perception, inference, natural world, and other things that became Plato Aristotelian thinking. This was the thinking until the onset of Christianity. Christianity from Constantine, Rome onwards, is based on theological constructs. Then the Reformation period and other such things, a challenge to orthodoxy and a new way of thinking came about in Europe around 1500, 1600s with thinkers and other such people who were trying to look for rationality. It was Europe's understanding of rationality that came about with thinkers like René Descartes or several other people, Locke and other people who came about with certain kinds of thinking that was born from and desire to confront orthodoxy. Why did they do that? Copernicus looking, not no, Galileo looking through a telescope and looking at the moons of Jupiter going around the Jupiter, and that hit people like a hammer, because till then they were told the Aristotelian model that everything is going around the earth. Earth is stationary, flat, and everything is going around the earth. This is a challenge to the orthodoxy. So since then, people knew that if you encounter phenomena of the rational mind, perception, logical, there is truth to be found that is not there in the orthodoxy. So that thinking came about. Then, unfortunately, a kind of thinking came about that put man as the center of everything, this natural philosophy and so on, which modern thought, they went from theological frameworks to philosophical in modern thought. They went about putting man at the center, the natural form. That is when you see the Renaissance art of looking at the human forms and ideal and perspective painting and all of those things you see coming out of there. That also led to the individual at the center of the world, that it is for you, that you're doing for pleasure, that, this, and so on. That led to a rape and exploitation of resources going through industrial revolution, through the climate change of today. This is where we are, because we put ourselves at the center. I should not say we, the Western civilization put themselves at the center, and a model of development ensued through capitalism, because capitalism also was an outcome of modernist thought, that it is a capitalism that has, see, feudalism evolved into certain kind of ideas in the modern period and led to these kind of things. So bottom line, we are seeing an evolution of technology and commerce via capitalism, and commerce via consumption kind of model has been upheld, and we are seeing a great deal of problems over here. So the questions will come, how did they distort early knowledge? This distortion of early knowledge happened in two ways. One is the DNA of the knowledge. Where did the knowledge come from? That has been cut off by saying Greek, Renaissance, that's where it is. So the dishonesty over there. Second is the misuse of technology itself. Technology has been misused to put man at the center, a consumptive model as the goal of life, and capitalism that does not have any kind of thought other than making profit. If you're not growing, you're dying. That is a mantra, right? So that is a mantra that is echoed over here. But that has led to an unbridled rape of the earth and the resources. And today there are many corporates who don't want to see any of these ideas on climate change, restricting carbon and other such things, though they're forced to do it today. They're forced to adopt these things. So would a more responsible way of handling technology, growth, demand, consumption have meant in a different world? That question must be encountered. This question is deeply enmeshed with the history of Europe in that time frame. Europe was struggling for nationhood. Today, the modern countries of France, Germany, Britain, or United Kingdom, and Italy, Spain, these were not what they were in 1500s and 1600s. There was great turmoil over there in their quest for nationhood. So in their quest for nationhood, when people saw Spain and Portugal profiting off the colonial trade in various places, this whole notion of nationhood, I too need a piece of the action, and other things came about. So there was a kind of a rush to get out there and exploit the world. So that has in a way influenced industrial revolution, because industrial revolution is a product of Britain. And the product of Britain, it is basically came about because they saw the fantastic textile trade of India. And they wanted to basically usurp all of this money to themselves. So that was what led to the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and other such things, eventually taking over the entire thing and killing off trade, poverty in India, enrichment of Britain. So we are seeing growth has happened in a certain way. Frank, I'm sorry, it's a very big question to what you've asked, because the dimensions are so many. It's not a single dimension answer. There are multi dimensions to this answer. But you can put them all together and say it is a unique development of capitalism, of greed, of growth, of lack of humanity that has came about from Europe between 15, 1600s, 1700s, when they rationalized just about every nonsense and horrendous murderous thing they did, like slavery and other things, or indentured labor, and they were able to go towards profitability. So this has been the misuse of ancient Indian knowledge systems that have led to this, that and where we are today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, no. It's thousands of years of information being crammed up into 10
Yes.
minutes. So I really appreciate you for what you've done and how you summarized the entire thing. I'd like to have a detailed conversation and a detailed program with you on this very subject. But before I let you go, Dr. Vedam, your final thought on what's the best way forward.
So the best way forward is, I guess, the we need to come out with the truth, and obviously each person thinks they have a monopoly on the truth. So I completely agree with that viewpoint. But the point is, we cannot have multiple versions of the truth. So the next best thing that we can do is study the frameworks. So we owe ourselves that honesty in our social studies and others. When we teach our children, we need to teach them correctly. NCRT and other things need to be aware of the amount of nonsense they put into the textbooks over various iterations that they have done. Be aware of that and put in content over there that tells children to recognize that yes, if somebody says this, it is the colonial people who came to India and did this. Take ownership of the narrative. Your narrative should not conveniently take colonial because it suits your ideological purpose, whether you're a Marxist or socialist. You should not take the Eurocentric line because it suits your purpose. That should not be the motivation over here. The motivation should be to create the Bharatiya person, the Indian who's proud and can connect to his past. You need that kind of thinking in India, among Indians. So to do that, go into the textbooks and present the frameworks. When you see a sentence, say this sentence is from this colonial field of school of thinking. This thinking is from the Eurocentric school of thinking. This is from the socialists. This is from the missionaries. Let's call it out. Let's call it out and present what is the ancient Bharatiya way of doing, because this is what we can relate to, at least maybe one generation ago. We could relate to this is what the Indian practices were. Let's put them over there because this is who we are as a people. Like I said, have a cup of tea and talk about who we are as a people. We need to talk about that in the textbooks. We need to make sure textbooks ask that question, teach children. So my vision, I'm hoping that this government or the next government or whoever comes there takes this beyond politics. It's an existential issue. It is not a question of protecting your vote banks, that this opposition thinks you create a vote bank by doing certain deracilations over there. That is not the point. You're destroying something. The dharma of what you're doing should get into your heads, but then you need to be tuned into the civilization to understand what dharma is. If that does not take place, you perhaps don't understand what the right thing to do. Right thing is, for me, what is the right thing? That's all that matters. So you can't continue doing deracination to create your vote banks. You've got to understand that. On the other side, if people are trying to reclaim their identity over here, it does not automatically politicize them to the other camp. There is no reason why all the Indians involved here can't come out there and say, regardless of our political ideology, this is who we are as a people. I guess I'm a rash idealist over here, Frank, and asking for this, but this is what I'd like to see. Whether you are in this opposition or the ruling party, come together and say, own up, say this is us, this is who we are as a people, this is our identity, connect back. You cannot no longer go back and say that our founder in 1947 said this is who we are, and we are going to continue with this ideology. That's a dangerous track we are on. So I'm hoping that whichever government comes to power, we will institute a set of institutions, universities, and so on, where the sixth neglected framework can be studied, create a formidable amount of scholarship, and an ecosystem to be created for them so that graduates from there can get jobs as lecturers and professors, which today is denied to them by the vice chancellors in many of these places, or all of Marxist leaning or socialist leaning. Make an ecosystem where they can thrive. And then perhaps 20, 30 years down the road, we'll see a change. I'm hoping for that.
Absolutely. It is important to know who we are, where we come from, and what we have done in the past to ensure that we make a better future. And on that note, I'd like to call it a wrap on this edition of Frank Talk. Dr. Raj Vedam, a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for enlightening us with your knowledge and all the work that you've put in over the years to try and get all this information. Thank you for sharing it with us. It is a treasure trove too.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to have been on your show. Thank you, Frank. I'll be
Pleasure.
very happy to be here.
Thank you so very much. And I'm going to leave with a promise from you that we will meet again very soon to talk about many more interesting aspects of Indic history, Indic knowledge systems, and everything else, because there's so much for us to learn and so much for us to take away too. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It'll be my privilege. Thank you. You can do that.
That's it on this edition of Frank Talk. See you again next time.